Good morning again, everyone. I want to tell you a story. It was about 10, 15 years ago. I can't remember exactly, but I was on a trip to Scotland, my home country, if I haven't slipped that into a homily before. And it was the last night. I was staying with my mom's sister, my aunt, and I was packing my bag to go home, and she said to me, "Jim," because my family call me Jim. No one else is allowed to call me Jim, just saying. She said, "Jim, I've got this stuff for your mom that she wanted me to get for her for you to take home." And she handed me a paper bag. I said, "What is it?" She said, "Well, it's pantyhose and things like that. It's a brand she can't get in Canada." And I looked in, and there's pantyhose and what looks to be like women's underwear, all this. I said, "Whatever," and I took it, put it in my bag. Yeah, you know where this is going, right? Next morning, fly to London, direct flight to Halifax, pick up my bag, going through customs. "Sir, do you mind if we take a look in your bag?" I was like, "Yeah, sure, whatever." And as the guy was unzipping it, I remembered what was in my bag, and my blood ran cold. And he started going through the bag, and sure enough, he pulls out the paper bag and starts taking various items of women's underwear out of this paper bag. And I just wanted the floor to open up and swallow me. I just felt so embarrassed. And I mumbled something about, "Yeah, they're for my mom." He didn't respond. And then he asked the dreaded question, "So what do you do for a living?" I told him I'm a professional skydiver. Anyway. It was one of these moments. Have you ever had a moment like this? Right? I mean, I know we've all got our own most embarrassing stories, right? We've got our most embarrassing experiences. We got that story. And we remember them so well. They're imprinted on us because generally we don't so much remember events or things that were said as much as we remember how we felt. And when we're embarrassed, we are left to feel foolish, disempowered. We are brought low. We are humiliated. We even feel worthless. I think that's why in every culture, when we experience embarrassment, what do? We hide our faces. It's instinctual. No one enjoys feeling like this. In fact, we usually enjoy feeling the exact opposite. We enjoy feeling smart, powerful, strong. We enjoy the feeling of being respected and being valuable. The scriptures today tell us that God has a bias. That God is very biased, in fact, in this regard. In the first reading from the prophet Zephaniah, we hear that God seeks a people humble and lowly. In the second reading from St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, we hear that God has chosen foolish and weak things. St. Paul writes to the Corinthians and he says, "Brothers and sisters, how many of you, when you were called by God, were of noble birth? How many of you had power in an earthly sense?" He says, God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing the things that are. That's right, the attributes that we would consider embarrassing, God prefers. And this theme is reinforced in the gospel this weekend. This part of the gospel which is known as the Sermon on the Mount. It covers many, many chapters in Matthew's gospel. We're at the beginning of reading through this sermon, at least up until Lent. And at the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount is a passage called the Beatitudes, where Jesus proclaims particular groups of people to be blessed or blessed or happy. And once again, everything is in reverse. It is those who mourn who are blessed. It is those who are meek who are blessed. It is the persecuted who are blessed. Jesus sums it up in his opening line by saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven." That, in fact, was our psalm response today. Did you notice that? The response to the psalm was a gospel passage. Blessed are the poor in spirit. But what does this mean? What does it mean to be poor in spirit? Think about that for a second. I don't think there's any exhaustive answer to that question, but at least in my opinion, I believe to be poor in spirit means to be aware, to be self-aware that we are impoverished, humanly impoverished. I'm not talking about material wealth here. I'm talking about how we are spiritually impoverished, emotionally impoverished, relationally impoverished. To be poor in spirit means that we are aware of our own brokenness, our own imperfections, our own weakness. I mean, are there any broken people in church this morning besides me? A few of us. Well, we can have coffee together after Mass. Are there any imperfect people? Yeah, all you perfect people, huh? Are there any fibbers? Are there any weak people? You see, we are poor in spirit. To be poor in spirit is to know our need for God. See, if we're not in touch with our brokenness, with our imperfections, with our woundedness, our flaws, our sins, we don't need salvation. We can save ourselves. But when we are in touch with this, we are poor in spirit. And ironically, it's when we are poor in spirit that we become spiritually rich. It's when we are poor in spirit that God can actually use us. When we let go of the illusion of our wisdom and our strength and embrace our foolishness and weakness. So what do you say? Let's become foolish and weak. What do you think? See, God is able to use us when we stop explaining to ourselves and others and even to God all the reasons that God could not possibly use someone like us. Have you ever done that before? Because of our awareness of our weakness, our flaws, we think, God, you could never use me. We take ourselves off the list. God, you could never use someone like me because just fill in the blank. We say it to ourselves, to one another, and to God. But here's the thing. The reason we think God could not work through us, the reasons are the very reasons He can. Think about that for a second. The reasons we think God cannot use someone like us are the very reasons God will use someone like us. And there is nothing more satisfying than experiencing God working through us, not in spite of our weaknesses, but because of them. But there is one condition. We must give our yes. We must consent to it. We must give God permission, in a sense. We need to say, Lord, here I am. Use me. And perhaps some of us have never prayed that prayer before because even the idea that God would use someone like us, it doesn't enter our universe. But God wants to use what is weak and foolish to shame the strong and the wise. Over the last 2.5 years, we've been through a lot as a parish, haven't we? I know some of you are new to the parish. Some of you weren't here 2.5 years ago. But those of you who were, it's been a rough ride. We've gone through parish mergers, through a pandemic, all kinds of changes. And in the midst of that reality, we try to address a bigger reality that has been embracing us over the last number of decades, and that is the reality of decline in terms of the direction of health and not being healthy. We've been going the not healthy direction for quite a long time. And we're trying to turn that around. We're trying to become a church that is healthy and growing. And for this to happen, it's not just about growing the number of people at Sunday Mass. It's about the mobilization of the members of our community, the mobilization of our parishioners, seeing an increasing number of parishioners saying, and not just in spite of my weaknesses, but even through them, God, here I am, use me. You know, over the years in different parishes, I've often thought that parishes are kind of like an engine. Now, engines exist for a purpose. Different engines serve different purposes. They are complex, they have many parts, but when all the parts work together, an engine has incredible power to make a difference. But I believe that many of even our best parishes usually function at about 20% of their capacity. 20% of engine power. Do you know why? Because the gifts that reside in the parish have never been activated, the gifts of the baptized. And when you drill down on this, I think one of the root causes is simply that many people don't believe that God could ever use them. God could never use someone like me. God would never use someone like me. And so many gifts remain unactivated. Now, has anyone ever seen the movie called Cast Away? Put up your hand if you've seen this movie. Well, very good. It's highly recommended. It came out in the year 2000. It stars Tom Hanks. Yes, that is Tom Hanks underneath the scraggly hair and the beard. It tells the story of a man who works for FedEx. And he's in a FedEx plane, and his plane crashes in the Pacific, and he ends up marooned on a desert island for 5 years before he's rescued. That's all I'm going to tell you about the movie. But in 2003, on Super Bowl Sunday, which is coming up soon, FedEx released a commercial based on this movie. And the commercial featured a Tom Hanks-like figure, complete with the crazy hair and the scraggy beard, and a disheveled FedEx uniform, and he's shown holding a rather battered FedEx box, and he's standing on a street, and there's beautiful cinematic music, and he's looking at the addresses and looking down at the box, and then he finds the house where the box belongs. And as he walks towards the door, the music swells, and he rings the doorbell, ding dong, and the door opens, and there's a woman standing there. And he explains to her that he was marooned on a desert island for 5 years, that he almost died, and the only thing he had was this FedEx box. And he's at her door today to deliver this box because he works for FedEx. And the woman, for her part, is astonished, and she thanks the man for his dedication, and the FedEx employee begins to walk away, and he pauses and he turns around. And the music again swells, and he says, "By the way, what's in the box?" So she opens it, and she says, "Nothing really, just a satellite phone." A GPS locator, a fishing rod, water purifier, and some seeds. Silly stuff. And the commercial ends. You see, we already have everything we need to turn our parish in the direction of health. We already have it in the box. Everything we need to become a healthy and growing parish. We just need to give God permission to use us. So here's what I'm asking us to do today. Every single one of us. Today at communion time, whether you're receiving Holy Communion or not, enter into prayer. And let's offer to God all of our weaknesses. Let's name the reasons we think God could never use someone like us. And let's remember that the reasons we think God could not work through us are the very reasons He can. Let's give our yes to God and pray, "Here I am, use me." Let's allow the Lord to open up our boxes, open up our suitcases, because no matter what He finds inside, we won't be embarrassed.